There we are. We are live from Stanford Aware Technologies, and welcome to the on-site folks and our virtual participants. Let's start with you, Rebecca.
Sure. I'm Rebecca Hogue. I am a co-director of Virtually Connecting, and I'm actually not presenting anything here, so I'm here observing, and it's been fantastic so far. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from you guys.
Matt Frostlin, Learning Innovation Coordinator from the Link Research Lab. And I did present today during some kind of Christmas parade right outside the door with walking trees and I don't know, what was awesome.
Marching bands, walking trees, yeah.
Sound effects, it was pretty cool.
At first we thought it was a protest, but then the music got really happy, so clearly it wasn't a protest.
It's a different way of wearing your wearables?
Yeah, it was wearing a tree.
And Rick.
Hi, I'm Rick Voigthofer from Ohio State University, and I presented today on ethics, on information ethics specifically in wearables, and was presenting the work of Luciano Floridi, who's an information ethicist, trying to think through some of the ethical implications, sort of coming with a broad model of thinking through some of the ethical implications, and I was using the example of informed consent as one way to think through some of the ethical implications of using wearables for both research and also as a mechanism to feed back to students about what's happening while they learn.
Okay, why don't we start with Autumn?
Hey everybody, my name is Autumn Keynes and I am the Associate Director of Academic Technology at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. I'm also a co-director of Virtually Connecting and I'm really excited to be here. Some of those folks on site are some of my favorite people, and so yeah, as well as the virtual folks, so really excited to be here today.
Brittany, please.
Hi, I'm Brittany Brown O'Donnell. I'm an instructional design grad student at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, and I have my wearable on. So, yes, I'm excited for this conversation today.
Chuck.
I'm Chuck Pearson. I'm an associate professor in natural sciences at Tusculum College in Greenville, Tennessee. I have no wearable this evening.
Good for you.
And I am Helen DeWard. I'm hosting Virtually Connecting this evening from the beautiful skyline of downtown Toronto, where I am spending the evening. And I'm very excited to be here and talking because I had an opportunity to talk to Maya Georgieva and Emery Craig from Digital Bodies last June at New Media Consortium Conference, and it's really piqued my interest on the fit for where wearables are going for our students. So it's nice to meet you. Tell us what's going on and the big conversations, the topics that have been shared.
Big insights.
So, who else is joining us? Will we be seeing them? This is my first time doing this. I'm curious, are there, I'm assuming there's other people out there. Will they be typing in text, and how can we interact with them as well?
And we will have other viewers. This is our participants for now, and other viewers will be tweeting questions in as we're talking.
Excellent.
And you're off the screen.
I'm off the
Just fell
screen.
off camera.
Excellent. So tell us some of the stuff you didn't get to share from your presentation.
Oh gosh. I got about halfway through. So basically, one of I was trying to think through the idea of wearables through information ethics. And one of the things that Floridi talks about is this idea of the info space. And he thinks that, ethics, that information space, a place where everything from from library books to our social media experience to data that gets collected while we learn is a site for ethical responsibility, if you will, rather than. In my talk, I was sort of making a distinction between moral responsibility, which is who is to blame, versus moral accountability, which is more who is to pay, in a sense of, and so if for example, there's a breach in privacy, so that's kind of an obvious one with wearable technologies. Rather than finding out that a particular individual, like a interface designer, made a mistake, or a programmer, it's more looking at where the program doesn't work, and so sort of taking this idea of moral accountability. One of the things I focused on was the idea of wearables as an interface between the individual and the world, and that interface is an abstraction of some way or another. And when we and it can be dangerous if we take that abstraction as neutral. And so, let's just say you're using something that an EEG that has maybe 14 points of data from your brain. But that's only 14 points. There's a degree of fidelity there. And so one of the ideas I focused on is the idea, and this is the part I didn't really get to, is the idea of information transparency, in the sense that if you're a research subject, or someone who, wearables have certainly become part of, they're also a cultural phenomenon. This whole notion of the quantified self is, and so people see themselves in terms, we talked a lot, and there's a lot of critique today, for example, the idea of the Fitbit. But when we think of ourselves in terms of the 10,000 steps versus, versus maybe one of the keynotes talked about versus the enjoyment of the walk, let's say, we see ourselves differently. And so, one of the points that I was trying to make is that people who, researchers, engineers, and also product designers, because many of these wearable technologies are commercial products, where people are trying to sell something, and so each of those has different. This is Floridi's term, the idea of different levels of abstraction, and so. Levels of abstraction, and those levels of abstraction don't necessarily match up with the end user, the learner, that it can lead to, we talk today, people may become, have a product designer or a company may have an advantage because the end user doesn't know exactly how that information is going to be used. Or and this is when I started to talk about the idea of informed consent. The informed consent is based on this idea of front-loading, that we sort of, when we do research, we already can anticipate all the risks, right? And that we can tell the participant what the risks are. And after the study starts, there's really there's no place for, the participant to get more information about what's happening with their data. And with these large, with a large data set, potentially, of a wearable, that could be maybe integrated with other kinds of data that, our whole notion of informed consent is outdated, perhaps. It is. And particularly when you have, and this is the point I didn't get to talk about as much, when you have, informed consent is, it doesn't apply to, for example, to companies. It's for research institutions. And so when you have a mixture maybe of different, of different players, and some of them maybe have different ethical responsibility, different ethical standards, and the person, the end user doesn't know what those are, those different levels of abstraction, that it's the there's the potential for a lack of transparency, if you will, and so. And a lot of, there's a lot of organizations, even the whole idea of, informed consent is based on sort of is based on the idea of biological research. And in the IRB, we often have this exception category, where a lot of the researchers that education falls under. But there still needs to be, I think, in the literature, there still needs to be some more development. And so the last point that I'll make is one of the things that I think maybe is different and unique about wearables, and the thing that I call them is sort of an intimate interface between ourselves and the world. And so I think there's something different about that, in terms of the interfaces provide some representation of our emotional state, of our physical state. And so, and without understanding how that process gets fed back to you in the infosphere, there's lots of work to be done in sort of thinking these things through. And so in my presentation, in the second half, I was basically trying to set up a framework to maybe talk about these things.
Wow. there are so many connections and questions that little bit has just prompted. I'm thinking of giving every kid a Fitbit. Well, where are the ethical questions that come up, and where's the informed consent that?
What does the company collect versus what the individuals are collecting?
Right.
So we look at it as researchers, and if you give them all Fitbits, you make them all join a team or something so that you can track it. But what is Fitbit collecting? Because they don't have the same ethical guidelines,
right.
Nor do countries, by the way, as I'm discovering. The ethical guidelines for research in Canada are quite different than they are in the US. And that too sort of plays an interesting role when we're dealing with now things that are international in nature.
Now apparently hackers can hack into your Fitbits and other devices through your phone. We found out, people were saying today, so people even haven't considered that yet, is the hacking that can happen not walking around.
And then who's ethically responsible for the loss of that data? That, I walked 10,000 steps for every day for 30 days, and my data has been hacked. Who's ethically responsible? Or morally responsible?
Some of the reading that I've been doing has looked exactly at that. They call it neurohacking, and it's not just stealing of data, but it's also inserting different data, if you will, and so so if you think about those interface sites, that those are sites to steal and sites to insert information. Sort of an extreme example of some of that is hacking someone's pacemaker. That's clearly that's not neurological, but the interfaces, and one of the things I was trying to talk about is the interfaces are becoming. I used an example of a lab here that's working on a bio interface on the cellular level between cells, and electrodes, and so I'm kind of imagining, not just measuring skin conductance, but much higher levels of what's the word I'm looking for? Fidelity, if you will, of the data, in terms of what's happening. And so this, the idea of hacking, of stealing, private information, but also inserting information is really, and a woman today was talking about being at a security conference, and someone hacked into her phone at the security conference and then from the phone hacked into her Garmin watch, you know, and so.
Chuck, it looks like Chuck was going to jump in.
Oh, this is me jumping in. Okay. Now I'm listening to this. I do this. I'm listening to this conversation and recognizing parallels with what I'm doing regards to educational data collecting, online homework management, some of them proprietary, some of them open source, what have you. But all of it always collecting data. All of it always bringing some collection of what the student is actually accomplishing in an academic setting and collecting it in some data file. And obviously, if I've got that in the hands of Pearson Higher Education, no relation, then they are going to be in control of that data and they can do whatever they want to with that data. Are there mechanisms that exist in wearable technology right now for data to be collected and be maintained separate from the corporation that sells you your Fitbit or what have you? Is there a means that you can retain your own control of data rather than just handing it over to the corporation and letting them do their thing with it?
Who looks for the quantified self-regulation? Because they're all about hacking devices, right? And they're often about hacking devices to do what they need to do. My husband was just posting something yesterday.
Rebecca, you're dropping out there. I missed that last couple of sentences.
Sorry, I was talking about the quantified self movement.
Right.
And they're all about hacking into devices. And so one of the things that just came out recently is they've hacked into a blood sugar monitor and an insulin pump. And so from the phone to actually, you know, almost create the AI for an artificial pancreas. And that kind of sort of learning kind of thing, but that's happening because the SDKs, the service, the development kits are being made available to the hacker community.
There's also a modular wearables technology where you can get little pieces and build your own, you know, type of Fitbit. It's probably going to be a lot funkier for a long time to do that, but we'll probably see a lot more of that happening, especially if people get more concerned about the data and the companies and what are they doing with this data, especially when someone mentions Fitbit. When you mentioned the Fitbit company collecting all this data, I was like, oh yeah, Fitbit kind of knows like where I'm walking, how much I'm walking, you know, what all people infer from that. So I'm a little scared now, hold on.
Actually, it's interesting because Open collecting Fitbit data. So you can actually upload your Fitbit data and your Runkeeper data to Open Humans. And they've actually done some research where they can show based upon the layout of your streets, your health level. Like, so they can make predictions based upon how the streets are laid out in your neighborhood. And all of that's from data. And that's something we didn't get to today was the idea of people willingly giving up their data. Because that's a huge issue in healthcare, where everything is so much about protecting it. But what if I want to give it to somebody, right? I want to give it to researchers.
Yes.
But that goes back to what you were saying, Rick, about informed consent. And how do you determine where that starts and stops? And is it a longevity type of informed consent? Or are there little steps to informed consent as people get into this, using wearables in their everyday life or using wearables in their classrooms?
But I think we also need to change our paradigm as researchers and stop thinking about the people that are participants in our research as naive subjects that don't have a right to their own data.
Right.
Because I think that that's a fundamental philosophy shift in how we go about doing research.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got to just echo that. And I think that goes back to the transparency piece, right? And so this is one of my beefs with, technology analytics kind of companies that are very assessment based, right? They come in I listen to their presentations, and they have all this amazing data that they can gather on students, usually not with wearables, but we're probably going there, right? I mean, if I could figure out, like, what happens in a heart rate, like when a student has an aha moment, right? Or like, do they start to perspire a little bit more, or whatever? If I can start to kind of pinpoint what those aha moments are for a specific student, I mean, I could really do a lot with that. So I haven't actually seen a lot of these companies come in and talk about using wearables, but they talk about using, for instance, information from the learning management system, or information from, other data that we use in other university-based systems. And I sit there through the whole presentation, and at the end I say, okay, how does the student interface with the data? Well, the student just gives us the data, and we keep it on the back end, and the administrator sees it. Maybe the faculty member sees it. It's like, no, the student needs to own the data, right? In my mind. And I think there's a huge learning opportunity there as well. I think if we start giving students more access to their own data, they start to imagine, at least they have the possibility of imagining, how other companies might be tracking them, how other public services that they give their data to, like social media, things like that, how those companies might be doing it in less transparent ways. And I feel like we have a responsibility as educators to be more transparent, so that we can give students those opportunities to realize how their data might be being used.
And I'm going to jump in, because there is a certain company with a certain big name that is going to do some research, providing a wristband to students to measure heart rate and perspiration rates, to measure engagement in lessons.
Yes.
We actually had some interesting conversations this morning, because the first or second presentation was talking about the need to define what actually engagement is, and our inability to actually, have what do they call it, inter-rater reliability, right? You get two researchers and they both can't agree on what engagement is. And so adding a technology is not going to solve that problem necessarily until we know what engagement means.
And I wonder if that's a consideration for that particular project, that direction that big named company is going.
I see Brittany's asked, has anyone brought up
Polyvagal.
Vagal and stress levels? No. Could you tell us about that?
So my therapist actually brought up polyvagal. That was my first introduction to it. Apparently, it's a newer theory, and so it's autonomic, parasympathetic nervous system relationships, and the current way of tracking it is like the interval between the R levels and the heart rate. So you actually have to have, like, my little fit. I have an up. My up can't do it, but you have to have the, like, chest strap monitors. But it monitors the resting level and says how well your nervous system is actually in response. And it's linked to, the polyvagal theory is actually linked to all sorts of things like autism and PTSD and things like that. So the current thinking is the more stressed you are, it changes this interval. And so you can even, like, there's apps now that you can track. If you have the fancy heart monitor, you can track and, like, wake up in the morning and be like, oh, I'm really stressed today, I should take it easy. Or, like, I'm not very stressed today, I can go do stuff. And when I think about wearables in education, like, I can see that being used both from an educator sense and, like, hacked by students, right? Like, oh, I don't feel like doing stuff today, I'm real stressed. Let me figure out how to say today's a real stressful day.
Well, I'm trying to think of which, somebody did actually mention that. I'm trying to figure out which one it was, because it was early in the day. We've had a lot of presentations today where they actually did mention, actually describing the difference between the heart rates, like the fact that you actually measure the space in between, not
Heart rate variability.
Yeah, heart rate variability. And that sort of link, which I thought was kind of fascinating and complicated.
Yeah, that all feeds back to the polyvagal theory. which is about the vagus nerve, which is where the vagal comes from.
One of the interesting points that was made, I think his name was Sidney, the first presenter.
Yeah.
It was the keynote, yeah.
The keynote. And he talked about, I think it was he that talked about this idea that when you take something like heart rate, a person doesn't have like a universal baseline, that it's different every day, depending on these various factors. And so different, and he also talked about this idea of, maybe this was someone else who talked about this idea of when you do something in the lab versus doing a study, in a classroom, that things are very different. There's a lot of talk, or not a lot, but, talking about this idea of, having to sort of calibrate for a particular context and for the individuals and even for the day. But yeah, this idea of heart rate variability was, certainly, and there's a lot, I guess there's a lot of research around that to support the relationship to, different responses of the central nervous system. And there's also a lot of, we haven't talked that much now about the idea of facial recognition too. Some of the research that's being done there. But it was interesting, sort of time and time again, of people trying to think about more, generalizable, like prototypical expressions versus, things that may be unique for the individual. They showed us one video of two people, and he asked, which person is daydreaming, and and it was, we couldn't tell. We couldn't tell who was, there's sort of a 50-50 chance you got it right. But there was not necessarily from their facial expression, any sense of that. But sort of to work back to Brittany, what you were talking about, this idea of, having, there's also I'm sorry, I'm not good about name attribution, but there's also discussion of the, of the idea of sort of mindfulness and research in terms of, how wearables can feed back things to you to, be mindful of, of what's happening with your body to maybe come to a state that is, maybe I'll use the word calmer if you're in an anxious state in ways that otherwise may not be possible. There's also and I guess all these things are available on Periscope. The lunch keynote was from the perspective of someone who she had her feet in art and dance, human computer interaction and design, and thinking about wearables as restorative technologies, I think was the term that she used, right? Almost, how technologies can be used to sort of reconnect to the body. One of the things I was thinking about was technologies, our technology is also responsible for disconnecting us with our bodies. And then so using so they're also, and then using them to reconnect with the bodies was sort of an interesting loop. But it was sort of, there's a really interesting part of, of today was just the interdisciplinary nature of, of the people working here, and some common languages and some new languages, and trying to figure out like how can, where do we go from here? What do we do with this? Is this a new community or a new identity, or, and so there's lots of talk about other conferences, like one that I learned about called CHI,
the computer-human interaction. It's a SIG of the ACM, Association for Computing Machine Learning.
Right, and learning analytics conference, and so there's it was sort of so the conference is small, but it's interesting in that sense of I've never been in something, in conversations where, it's much more emergent as a field, and I guess there's so much people are trying to figure out, and I mean some of the research goes back, a long time that they've been doing, but there seems, there's a point now where there's enough that the technology has matured enough that people are using technologies to do research that don't cost thousands of dollars, and are being able to do some pretty sophisticated work.
Yeah, the idea of the connect things. So I want to put it over to Matt for a second and ask you about we heard vaguely about some toys happening at the Link Lab where you guys playing with some interesting things. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you guys are playing with?
Well, I want one of these little stress detectors to hook up to Facebook. And so it can just, tell you, you sound stressed today, Matt.
Yeah.
Don't go on Facebook. We've started looking at a little bit into virtual reality. And so I spoke today on the intersection of virtual reality, wearables, and instructional design and theory, and the need to approach these from a stronger theoretical perspective, looking at not just, what cool stuff can we do with these, but also how can we get the students involved in this? How can we get the students involved in creating apps and creating virtual reality simulations and creating activities for wearables, just getting students involved really on every level of that. And so we've I guess is the best word for it at the Link Lab, where we're talking with all different people who are interested in virtual reality or have been working in it. We found that one person in this group has been researching virtual reality for 16 years. Mm. So it's been around for a lot longer for some people's usage. He has haptic feedback devices and all kinds of things. So we're looking at nursing, planetarium people were there for astronomy, engineering, of course. So we have some interesting groups there, and really would like to see it expand beyond just virtual reality for the sake of, okay, can we make our movies 3D now and immersive, but can we actually do something with it that's interactive and not passive? And can we also combine it with wearables so that it would have some kind of element of interaction, so you're not just sitting there the whole time.
And can you do it in an affordable way? Because it's like, look at things like the Coast Guard and stuff like that. They've been doing these, really complex simulations for a long time, and these sim centers, air traffic controllers as well, for a long time. But those are like $1 million machines. We can't take that to the everyday classroom.
It's also, we touching a little bit on the ethical issues too. People in virtual reality, I was reading something about how someone had been attacked in virtual reality basically because they just piped in their voices to this virtual reality game and didn't even think about the ethics behind it, right? And so, guys are in there and they could recognize the person next to her as a woman and started doing some things they should have done. And, there's things like that. You start bringing in a more of a design and user perspective that could potentially be better dealt with, and you just get a bunch of people together like, ooh, this is a cool idea, let's do it because it's cool. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the intersection of what I was talking about today.
So in terms of the conference experience, it really looks like there's some opening of conversations and building some bridges between different areas of study.
I think there's going to be a little bit more of that tomorrow than there was today. Today was pretty intense with presentations. And I know that at the end of the day, George, and I did get that on Periscope, George did do the sort of debrief for about 20 minutes at the end of the day to try and bring some of these things together. But I think there's actually more time built into the schedule tomorrow for that.
Work groups tomorrow morning.
Good. I'm really aware of the time, and I know you've taken time at the end of a hectic day to talk to us. I haven't seen any questions coming through on Twitter, but I think that even just having a chance to hear some of the topics is really just burning some big issues in my thinking in terms of what I do with students. Any last thoughts or questions from the group that's here, virtual participants?
I know that the conference is small, but how many people are there?
5,000? No. There's 40, yeah, 40,
Yeah.
50, something like that, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's something special, I think, about those small conferences where you get to really kind of dig in. And so having a small conference around such an emergent topic is, yeah, it sounds like a really kind of like a very cool place to be right now.
Well, it's a bit of an interesting dynamic too, because we don't just have researchers in the room, we also have research scientists from different corporations. Like I met somebody from HP. And like, so it just seems kind of like this different, it isn't just the researchers in the room. There's also people looking at product, looking at it from that perspective.
Okay, not seeing any other final thoughts for Brittany or Chuck. And if not,
all good. Thank
all
you.
good. Yes, thank you very much for taking time at the end of a busy day. And I know that we'll be back with some more virtually connecting with George Siemens tomorrow. So thank you, Rebecca, for pulling this together. And I will sign off, stop the broadcast at this point.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Reach down and